Well, hello and welcome. This is Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics. Thanks very much for coming and spending some of your Tuesday evening with us. A very important conversation tonight, all about civil liberties and civil society and where is it going and is it going in the right direction or not? And I'm going to be joined by Robbie Barwick. Before I bring him in, let me just remind you, as I always do, that we don't provide specific financial legal advice on the channel. It's general conversation only. We do run the chat, and if you'd like to make a comment in the chat, feel free. Please just be a little bit cautious about things like racial slurs. We do moderate the chat as well, of course. This is out on the 25th of July 2023, if you're watching in replay. And if you'd like to get my attention and specifically ask a question, use @WalkTheWorld. That'll make sure it gets into my queue so I can see. And I've also enabled Super Chat, so if you'd like to get your question top of the list, you can use Super Chat to do that, or indeed make a contribution to what we do here. So there we go. That's the story. And I'm going to bring Robbie in. Robbie, hello.
Hello, Martin. How are we over there in sunny England?
It is sunny actually at the moment. We've had some really funny weather. We had a really hot June and then it went really cold, and it's sort of, I now remember what UK summers are like. Well, it's fine. It's good. I prefer to be a little cooler rather than a little warmer.
Oh, well, I don't. Can't wait for summer.
Indeed. Now, we've got a very important conversation tonight because there is, of course, a lot going on. And I think we're going to start the conversation with this bill, which is in discussion or draft exposure stage. We've got a couple of weeks time before effectively this thing really comes to a vote. Well, this is a really draconian bill, and it's all about reduction of free speech, isn't it?
Yep, and I think tonight is a continuation of the call to arms that we did last week. I mean, people have to see this as the kind of law that you've got to intervene on and stop, as we did. I see John Adams has just announced himself. Hello, John. But as we did, you and John Adams and me and the Citizens Party led back in 2019 on the cash ban bill, right? We saw the civil liberties implications of that. We intervened at this stage actually, and we succeeded. It set the intervention there and flooding the consultation on the exposure draft with objections, set the tone to help us eventually defeat the bill. We're going to do the same thing with this one because it's presented as well-intentioned, but that just means it's the road to hell. You go down that path and all the people get sucked in because it is well-intentioned. What they will find eventually is the powers that they thought were only going to be used to stamp out bad free speech can be used to stamp out good free speech. And it's always, this is why you don't have these kinds of laws. So yeah, we'll talk about the details, but I think everywhere at every stage of this conversation, pay attention and start thinking about, if you haven't made your submission yet to this exposure draft through the department, start thinking about what you're going to say, because we need you to make a submission. We need to nip this in the bud. Yes.
And there is a bit of a wave around the world, isn't there, of effectively governments, in a heavy-handed fashion trying to sort of dial back the debate and the conversation. My belief is that a lot of it is to do with the fact that they've lost the plot in terms of real policy and, real execution. So they're always trying to spin the story and first point. Second point is they don't like anybody criticizing the fact that they're doing that. So essentially this is a way of controlling the narrative. And in fact, more and more politicians are using social media for their own ends, but also are trying to actually stop free speech. And the critical question for me, Robbie, is once you start the slippery slope of saying, well, this free speech is okay, but that isn't, I mean, you end up in a rather difficult situation where who defines what is appropriate free speech and what is not?
Yep, and that's the issue with this bill. It's explicit in the bill. I'll give some examples of that in a second. But in terms of the reason why this is not just limited to Australia, this kind of phenomenon, is I think it all comes back to the state of the economy and the financial system. And the problem is, especially in the Western world, the neoliberal financial system has fallen into terminal decay and collapse. But we have a corrupted political system which is determined to prop it up. And for that reason, they have to suppress the anger of the populace. The reason the populations are angry and are not happy with the government is because the economy is not working for them anymore. And therefore, the populations, when they hear the government talk, the government has no credibility. But instead of these governments having a capacity to reflect on the fact that what they're saying has no credibility and realizing their faults in that, they seem incapable of doing that. And so they conjure up all sorts of scenarios to explain why people aren't believing them anymore. And we saw this in Technicolor when Donald Trump got elected. I wish I'd thought of it earlier. That memory just popped into my mind. But one of the best things you'll ever hear was this rant that the comedian documentarian Michael Moore had in 2016, in the middle of 2016. He went on this rant about the economy to explain why the former blue-collar skilled labor force of America, who now live in the Rust Belt because all their jobs are gone, were going to vote for Donald Trump because no one in the establishment believed Trump could win. But Michael Moore said, no, they're going to vote for him because they want someone to burn down the system, right? And he was dead right. Trump gets elected, but then instead of reflecting on why all those people were prepared to vote for such a spoiler, the American establishment, both Democrats and Republicans, and believe me, and Republicans, not just the Democrats, had to think, well, no, we've got to explain this away somehow. And they invented the whole Russian foreign interference narrative, right? And suddenly, social media is being seeded with foreign interference, with lies by these evil Russians to brainwash the American people to vote for their own destruction. That became the narrative. That's now completely debunked, but that was the narrative, right? It was just rubbish. And that's when we saw this stuff begin to be weaponized. And it's the same playbook now and the same motive. Governments do not want to face up to the fact that they must change their economic policies to revive these economies properly so that they once again serve the people. They don't want to do that. They want to stay indebted and enthralled to the vested interests. And so they're coming up with these kind of measures to increasingly suppress the outrage that they are provoking. That's the game plan here. That's what we have to bust up. And we have to make sure that when they come up with these measures, we see it clearly and actually intervene on it in that, with that understanding, right? Because only then are we going to punch through to the back of the head. And if I just share my screen here, I'll bring up just in relation to what you explicitly talked about, because yes, it comes down to, like with all these things, it comes down to interpretation, right? And so what I've got here is if you can see that, what I've got here is the fact sheet that the government has provided for this bill, Communications Legislation Amendment Combating Misinformation, Disinformation Bill 2023. And right here, you're going to see the three key words: misinformation, disinformation, and harm. And those three words are the moving parts of this bill. They can be interpreted any way you like. And they give examples a little bit later here of the kinds of things that, we'll just scroll down. They give examples of serious harm. So there's the hatred stuff, which we already have laws for, right? Misinformation about a group of Australians or other persons to commit hate crimes against that group. Disruption of public order or society in Australia. So things that the one example they used was, the claims about 5G causing COVID, led to vandalism on 5G towers. Harm to the Australian environment. This one though, because you can go through those yourself. You can see the various things. I won't gloss over them. Harm to the integrity of Australian democratic processes. And this is where it starts to get into the Trump area. Misinformation undermine the impartiality of an Australian electoral management body ahead of an election or referendum, right? You can't have questions about that. Harm to the health of Australians, and that gets into the stuff that we saw weaponised in COVID, misinformation that caused people to ingest or inject bleach products to treat a viral infection. That is explicitly about Trump. I'm laughing because I hadn't actually read that part closely before. So that is explicitly about Trump, misinformation that caused people to ingest or inject bleach products to treat a viral infection. So they would use this to shut down the President of the United States. Harm to the Australian environment, misinformation about water-saving measures during a prolonged drought period in a major town or city. And I think this last one goes into the area that I'm especially concerned about. Economic or financial harm to Australians, the Australian economy, or a sector of the Australian economy. Disinformation, an example is disinformation by a foreign actor targeting local producers in favour of imported goods. But okay, that's their example. But because this is open to interpretation, Martin, what if the government of the day decides that, Robbie Barwick and Martin North, or John Adams and Martin North in 2019, and all three of us sometimes, talking about the property bubble and talking about the places like Mandurah in Western Australia, where John Adams and I went to, and showed all the for sale signs. That was a real feature of that town at the time, and it was very different to most of the rest of the country, and an early sign that the property market was in trouble. What if the government of the day decides, well, hang on, we think that is undermining a sector of the Australian economy, right? And this is the kind of dangers that get opened up by this kind of law. Back in 2002, when the government passed its first raft of anti-terrorism laws following the 9/11 attack, our party led the opposition to those laws for similar reasons, because they passed laws which had very broad definitions in them, and one of those was a definition that basically could be construed as undermining or talking down the economy. You remember this term? They're talking down the economy. Talking down the economy could, in a roundabout way, be construed as something in the realm of a terrorism against Australians. So we were very worried about that. We highlighted that at the time. They're now passing a law, they want to pass a law that would just give them the power to shut that kind of discussion off. And that's why, you can say, look, as we discussed last week, there's so many things that drove me nuts during COVID about false claims. And I mean really false claims, like ridiculously, deliberately false claims. I'll give you one example that really got to me for some reason, because I had to deal with relatives on it. A video got around of Anastasia Palaszczuk getting a fake COVID injection, and you could actually see she got an injection in front of the media, and you could see that the nurse had the plastic cap on the end of the syringe, and we were told, the politicians are faking getting the injections. They're not going to take the injections that are bad for them, but they expect us to. Except whoever made this video made it deliberately deceptively, because they had to have seen it come from a larger video where the actual event was Anastasia Palaszczuk sat down, got an actual jab. You could see the needle actually go in without the cap, but it happened so quickly the media weren't set up for the shot. So Anastasia Palaszczuk gets up and they said, hang on, we didn't get a photo. Can you sit down and go through the motions again so we can get a shot? And it was the second one that someone packaged up into this video to make this kind of claim. And I saw that sort of thing, right? And so that's the sort of thing that drove me nuts. Those kind of deliberately deceptive claims. And yeah, And you can think, oh, why is people doing this? Should this sort of stuff be allowed? The problem is, if you indulge in that kind of thinking, right, and think, well, we need a shortcut way to shut down such communications, rather than think, no, we need to combat it through actual open discussion, you're opening the door to these broader powers that are definitely going to be used to not just shut down that kind of thinking, that kind of communication. They will shut down people just having normal opinions, questioning whether such and such a medication is the best for them, whether it should be mandated, etc. Right? What did the Premier of the Chief Minister of the Northern Territory say? Right? When he lost his, I forget his name. He's a distant memory now, whoever that bloke was. But he lashed out at anyone who questioned the mandates, right? And virtually screaming in a press conference. You give those kind of people these kind of powers, right? They will shut down all discussions in their zeal to supposedly protect us. But once they get that power, they'll make sure they keep telling us they're to protect us, but they'll be protecting themselves. And that's what this game has always been about when it comes down to censorship.
Robbie, let me just suggest you, if you're going to come off the screen share, it might be a good time to do that, because we can always...
Yeah, sorry. Keep reminding me, Mark.
Yeah.
I did forget that.
Yeah, exactly. And, I'm sure that people can read, but they like to see your ugly mug too. But the point I wanted to make was, with a bit of history here, right? For a number of generations, we had effectively society battling against lack of freedom, and if you go back over the centuries, we ended up with significant freedoms for individuals, and they were hard won over several generations, to the point where there was a lot of ability. Now in Australia, there is no formal Bill of Rights as to what is and what isn't okay, which is a problem, right? But what's happened in the recent years is this is all turning around. And in fact, if I go back a generation and think of what was acceptable compared with now, there are so many things that are now not acceptable that were a generation ago. Now, some of those you could argue was, maybe too far or whatever. But I'm just worried about this slippery slope, or the analogy I sometimes use is the frog in the pan, right? So you sort of put a frog in a pan of cold water, and then you heat up the water, and over time the frog doesn't notice the change in temperature until they're cooked. And what I feel is that this is a further step along the way of actually fundamentally changing the structure of society, and essentially reducing the capacity for individuals to have their own thoughts and opinions and their own rights and their own responsibilities as well. And effectively you end up with this sort of top-down imposed view of the world. And I have a personal view to say this isn't necessarily something which is from an Australian perspective. This seems to be almost a top-down global story, right? There are things you cannot now say, there are things that you cannot now think, and this is now the next generation. So what we're ending up with is a morphing of society into, well, people being treated like kids at the end of the day, and essentially ending up with being told what to think, what to do, how to behave. And I don't know where, but somewhere along the road here, we've just lost direction, and we've lost our freedoms.
Yeah, well, and like I said, I think the reason it's not just in Australia and seems global is because all around the world, governments that have basically followed the same economic model as we have are all similarly lacking in credibility, and they're all responding the same way, because the masters of the current financial system, and you and I especially have had these discussions identifying the power bases in institutions like the Bank for International Settlements, and how there's that increasing concentration of power through the central banks, etc. And our current Reserve Bank now has just had a review where it's going to actually get more supposed independence, and basically more become fall more under the control of the Bank for International Settlements and less under democratic control in Australia. They want to keep pushing ahead with that agenda, right? Which is they are the people that have destroyed our economy, and it's just going to make it worse. And so this is an economic bankers dictatorship, and they have to suppress the speech. But the cultural change you're talking about, I think there's two parts to it. One is this thing we call cancel culture, or the whole debate about woke, etc. That's infuriating, but that's still, as long as that's not legislated, right? You can. There's still, you can be prepared to be a pariah to have an unpopular view, right? But as long as that's not legislated, that's just something that's a feature of society, and you can be frustrated and you can lash out, and the comedians will go on a big revolt, and we're sort of seeing that happening. There's this big anti-woke backlash that's brewing right around the world, right? So that's one thing, and people felt like their speech was being suppressed, right? But it was all about how much courage you personally had. When they start to legislate it, though, Martin, that's when it gets really, really serious, right? Because, like I said, I was just able to cite then an example from, 20 years ago in the terrorism laws about terrorism, where we saw the scope to interfere with discussion about the economic system. We saw that then. And now we're seeing that kind of intent turbocharged with these kinds of laws. So it's a very slippery slope. And by the way, I don't know if you've ever, there's all sorts of informal rules for speech nowadays. Sorry, I got an itchy neck. There's all sorts of informal rules for speech nowadays. I've noticed that when you're trying to engage in public debate, you often get hit with these rules. One time a woman on Twitter accused me of mansplaining to her, so I had to learn that rule. Don't do that. And all I was a man giving my opinions. So she didn't like that. That's the kind of rule that you're talking about. But there's one of them is, a lot of people like to rub in your face this idea of logical fallacies, that you got to police the way you speech in case you fall for these logical fallacies, or apply them in debates. And some of those are things like ad hominem attacks, etc. But one of them that I've learned is a logical fallacy, that as soon as you say it, you'll get attacked, is by warning about the slippery slope. The slippery slope is now supposedly, okay, that's invalid to mention that in any kind of context. That's got to go out now. Well, you can't have that kind of warning. Really? I mean, anyone who's lived in the latter part, our whole lives have been on one cultural slippery slope, I would argue. The things people warn about 20 years ago start coming true today, right? And sometimes even quicker. There is a damn slippery slope, and we're certainly going down it. And the people who want to suppress free speech, they do not want us talking about these kinds of warnings of the slippery slope. But I got to make another point, because I think, like I said, the economy is a driver here, and these governments and their corporate masters, these corporate states that are so intent on maintaining their power. Exactly, George. Reductio ad absurdum is another method. And that's what it's about, shutting down conversation. I'm happy to have those arguments, though. I'm just getting distracted by George there. I'm happy to have those arguments, because I'll have that argument any day of the week. I'll say, shove your rules. I'm making my point. As long as that's not legislated. But when governments come in with reasons to legislate this, that's when it's starting to get really dangerous, as I said. But one of the most it's not bizarre, it's lawful. Probably the most hypocritical part of this particular bill that the government is pushing here is the part where it explicitly exempts all government communication from any kind of category of misinformation. If the government says it, and it's all government, Commonwealth, state and local government, under this law, if they say it, it cannot be misinformation by definition. Well, I've been around a while, so I just wanted, our researcher Melissa Harrison wrote this last year. we wrote an article. Learn from recent history. Almost all US, UK accusations against strategic targets are lies. And we went through a list. We compiled a list of the kinds of explicit, deliberate lies that our main allies, with our support, used to start wars. One of them, in 1990, when George H.W. Bush wanted to build global support for the first Gulf War, there was actually resistance in the US Congress to that war. So they had a hearing. And in that hearing, they had this 15-year-old Kuwaiti girl who described how the Iraqi soldiers had stormed into the hospital and had removed Kuwaiti babies from the incubators and left them to die on the floor. And she was crying as she said it. This was really moving testimony. It impacted the whole. It was televised live. It impacted the whole country. It got the country and the Congress behind the Gulf War, that first Gulf War, and it was all made up. That witness hadn't even been in Kuwait. She was the daughter of Kuwait's ambassador to Washington, and she had just been schooled to say that for that hearing, but they got their war. 10 years later or 13 years later, history was repeated with the illegal invasion of Iraq. We all know that one much better. That was weapons of mass destruction. Deliberate lies. People like Dick Cheney would call up the CIA and say, you're not doing good enough. Sex it up so I can use it, right? And Tony Blair did the same thing in the UK. They got the lies, they got the war. One of the lesser known ones is the Libya intervention in 2011. In the case of Libya, they had this narrative that Gaddafi had supplied troops with Viagra to encourage mass rape of these rebels in Benghazi. Gaddafi uses rape, etc. In 2016, and of course, that ended up in being this terrible, geopolitical catastrophe, really, because they took a very advanced country, Libya, and they turned it into a failed state, which became a haven for terrorism, and slavery started being traded again in Libya. ISIS and Al Qaeda were able to use it as a haven, etc. And in 2016, the UK House of Commons put out a report that acknowledged the whole thing was a total screw up, and said this policy was not informed by accurate intelligence. In particular, the government failed to identify the threat to civilians was overstated. The rebels included a significant Islamist element. The result was widespread human rights violations and the growth of ISIL or ISIS in North Africa. That's in a UK House of Commons report, acknowledging, that was a pack of lies as well. Those are actual lies, and you can go back further to the Gulf of Tonkin. I wrote about that recently, in 1964, the Gulf of Tonkin incident that was used to, or the second Gulf of Tonkin incident that was used to send the American troops into Vietnam and really escalate that war and become a 10-year disaster for the United States and for Asia, right? 500,000 American troops killed, 3 or 4 million, Vietnamese killed, all based on a lie of this Gulf of Tonkin incident. And under this bill, none of that gets classified as misinformation or disinformation. Instead, as a friend of mine said, what some 12-year-old might say as a prank on a social media post is treated as a greater threat than what governments are capable of doing with deliberately crafted lies. That's the evil in this kind of approach. And so, you got to look at it not just from the standpoint of okay, this is a well-intentioned but mistaken bill. This will have unintended consequences. You got to see through it in terms of their intention much more clearly than that. These are discredited governments that have an agenda to protect their failed economic system, including to the point of going to wars. And that's what we've been living through for decades now. Their populations are increasingly sick of that agenda and getting increasingly unruly, and they're bringing in these laws to shut us down. That's why we have to fight it.
Yeah, and as Darryl said, it's under the ACMA, powers to combat misinformation, disinformation, and make a submission. You've got a couple of weeks, right? Because this exposure bill is now out. Just a couple of
the 6th of August.
6th of August, right? So it's a bit like the cash ban all over again. A very short period for submissions. Now we know in the cash ban context, right? We ended up with something like 6,000 submissions, right? Which blew them away. This is
it was a shockwave.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, this is a pretty critical conversation now, because, if you feel that there is a significant risk, then make a submission. It's worth saying, Robbie, that there are lots of corners of opposition here from all sorts of different organisations, not just, from the political realm, but to others too. So there's quite a few people asking some pretty severe questions about this.
Well, the Human Rights Commission has criticised it. Usefully, the opposition has already criticised it. So David Coleman, who I don't have a strong opinion on one way or the other, but he actually wrote I think it was in the Australian today, he wrote a very useful article about this. He's the Shadow Communications Minister. And now, the reason that's useful, as John Adams would recognise, is unlike with the cash ban, when that first came out, it actually had bipartisan support. There was just an assumption in the Parliament on both sides that they were going to wave this through. It was only our interventionists that broke that. And once we got Labor to agree to an inquiry, right, then we were on the way to actually defeating the bill. So we had to break that bipartisanship. This already doesn't have bipartisan support by the looks of what David Coleman wrote. The caveat I'll add to that is the Liberals would have pushed ahead with their own version of this anyway, because this is part of a global agenda that everyone's sort of falling into line with. We warned about that in 2019 in the wake of the Christchurch massacre, because Jacinda Ardern, Scott Morrison, Emmanuel Macron, in fact, Macron and Ardern in France put out what they call the Paris Declaration, and that called for basically social media censorship. Morrison, and they used the bad examples, right? The fact that the Christchurch massacre had been live streamed on Facebook. I mean, no one's going to defend that, but that becomes the basis for a law that, even if it is. So I've just said this is not well-intentioned. But even if these things are well-intentioned, you cannot write a law that is that granular, that can be that specific to specific kind of scenarios. The law is always a blunt instrument, right? And that's life, that's law, those are laws, and we've learned to live with laws. But when the governments are always coming up with reasons to legislate more, because that's their first reflex to deal with something, legislate a law about it. When they're always doing that, then they come up with these very blunt instruments, and suddenly it's about, again, how do you we asked the question in 2019 when we wrote about it, how do you define what is harmful? No one's going to defend live streaming a massacre, but the rest is up to interpretation. And that's the same thing here. And that was 2019. That was pre-COVID, pre-5G towers being burned down, etc. So this was already in the works, and that was under the Liberals. So it's good that David Coleman has been critical, and he's been consistently critical of this in the last few weeks. So it looks like the coalition is picking up the public backlash. I've also noticed lots of places I turn, there's people talking about this law, and there's already a preemptive reaction to it. So that is good. That means there's more advanced opposition than back on the cash ban bill at the similar time. Therefore, every submission that is made will be adding to that that existing opposition and just helping to create more momentum, right? So the making of the submissions is absolutely vital. But then I've got a scoop, Martin. I've got some breaking news for your show, which I'm going to share my screen again, because I want people. I used an example before. Hang on, just bear with me. Got to queue up my screen. Oh, there it is. Can you see this thing called the Strategist?
Yep.
Yep, okay. So yesterday, this agency, the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, made it very clear in this article they're going to target our party under this kind of legal approach and this kind of law, because they want us classified as some form of agency of foreign influence in Australia. And of course, because they're the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, let me be provocative to your viewers. If you hate and distrust China, it's because you're brainwashed by this organisation. Otherwise, you're living high. The income your country does make comes from this country. That's our biggest and best customer. They've never threatened to invade us. Never even thought. It's the furthest thing from their mind. They are not a threat at all. I'm with Paul Keating on this, and some of you may have heard Paul Keating earlier the year and realised, hang on, he sounded like Robbie Barwick. Well, we're on the same page. It's all garbage, and it's all because of this organisation. This is the organisation that Paul Keating called out as well. So our party has been going after ASPI for 7 years, starting with this ridiculous claim in 2016 when the first online census failed. And it was because some modem was unplugged, because everything's outsourced, of course, and some modem was unplugged. And these clowns came out and said, China hacked the census, China hacked the census. And it's the millions of little claims like that continue pouring out of ASPI, and the very big claims that also pour out of ASPI that are just poison people's minds non-stop, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Any other country can do is reported in normal ways, but if China does absolutely normal things, it's always twisted by this crowd, and then the media they feed as a threat, right? For example, China buying up Australia when it was the smallest foreign investor in Australia for the size of its economy by far, right? But we had 10 years of China's buying up Australia, China's buying up Australia. Never true, absolutely not true. They weren't buying up all our farms or anything like that. The Americans and British already own us to the hilt. We don't own ourselves. We're owned by the Americans and the British, but we were told to hate China, hate China, hate China. So your regular viewers are familiar with me talking like this, but if you don't want to haven't taken me seriously up to now, start taking me seriously now based on this article, because this article is explicitly lining up the Citizens Party to say that what we do as a party is an agency of Chinese interference. Let me read you the key paragraphs here. What they're basically saying is on social media that China has likely, they use the term likely because they can't prove it, there are bots on social media, and especially on Twitter, there's bots, right? And they've identified that these are bots that make comments under, say, my posts and the Australian Citizens Party's posts, and that the intent of that is to amplify our message. Now, I noticed these bots. I started noticing them sometime in the last 12 months, and they put these silly benign comments there, and they have those ridiculous name, bunch of numbers as the handle of the account, and you can tell straight away they're bots. They've got 0 followers. So I've noticed that. And I've just been mildly amused that they've made comments under my articles. When we've looked at them, it was brought to my attention that they never share my articles. They keep making comments under them. And the comments are things like, I agree with your opinions, stuff like that. Just really something a computer would generate. When you look at them, though, half of these bots are sharing stuff from Marco Rubio in the United States, which is a pretty weird combination of sharing his stuff and commenting under my post, because if China is the issue, on China, Marco Rubio and me and the Citizens Party couldn't be further apart. He's a McCarthyite warmongering fool, a dangerous, dangerous person who would happily blow up the world in his demented hatred of China. We're trying to stop that, right? So we've got nothing in common. But anyway, so I don't know why they're assuming that these things are Chinese, but they are. So they made that claim that this is that somehow that China's deploying these bots. But then look at what they say about the intent. The campaign of these bots also amplifies. I'll just highlight what I'm reading so you can read along with me. The campaign also amplifies negative messaging on a broad range of topics, individuals and organisations, including, for example, ASIO, PwC, God forbid someone says something negative about PwC, and journalist Stan Grant. And Stan Grant is someone associated with ASPI, and that's one of the reasons he cops a fair amount of criticism, apart from the fact that he's a wanker. That's my opinion. I'll just leave it at that. But then let me keep reading. Major Australian banks are a key focus for many accounts in the campaign, including the Commonwealth Bank, the National Australia Bank, ANZ and Westpac. This includes claims that Australian banks aren't serving regional Australia and First Nations customers. Concurrently, the campaign promotes the views of certain individuals, such as former Prime Minister Paul Keating, and organisations, especially the Australian Citizens Party. And then going on, sometimes the content posted in this campaign is bespoke, as it appears in the targeting of ASIO. And sometimes it is copied from the tweets of real Australian people, including, for example, mainstream political commentators, anti-authority activists, individuals promoting conspiracies, and members of the Australian Citizens Party, including individuals replying to their tweets. As well as copying their content, the campaign also promotes these individuals through retweets, likes, and replies, and engages them in conversation. And the reason ASPI is highlighting this and highlighting us is because they've said at the top of this article that this is a campaign that's interfering in Australia's domestic political debate. That's what they say in this article. And at the end, they talk about, in the same context as the Trump interference thing, and the same context in which this bill is presented, they talk about this foreign interference as something that must be guarded, foreign interference through social media as something that must be guarded against. And the danger with what ASPI is trying to do with this article is target my party and me as someone that should be shut down off social media, so that because they've always wanted to shut us down, because we have helped to damage their credibility quite significantly with our consistent, accurate attacks on them. We're the only organisation in Australia, until Paul Keating identified them, that actually stands up to them. They are and our argument is simple. They are the foreign interference operation in Australia. They are funded by the US State Department to get our politicians and our public to be just as demented and McCarthyite paranoia about China as the United States is. Not for the interests of Australia, because we're going to blow ourselves up and shoot ourselves in the foot, but so that Americans can get the war they want, along the same, like a sort of an echo of the Ukraine thing, use Australia and Taiwan as proxies in a war against China, weaken China so America maintains its supremacy in the world. And to make us dumb enough to fall for that, they've got to make us paranoid and incite fear and hatred. And that's ASPI's job. And we've been calling that out. And they're now saying through this article, they would like to shut us down. And the timing of this article with this bill is not coincidental, right? So you've got all the big issues there. You've got the war agenda that that our party's been exposing. You've got the economic agenda, for crying out loud, the banks, right? They're somehow drawing a very long bow, trying to say that Beijing has some interest in whether banks in Australia maintain branches in the regions. Give me a break, right? But that's the lengths that they're willing to go through this article, just so they can brand us and what we're doing as something that needs to be feared and covered by this kind of law. That's what you're up against. We were already fighting this law before this article came out yesterday, but let's put it this way, it's given us much more resolve.
Yeah, absolutely. And just as we draw this part of the conversation to a bit of a close and move forward a bit, again, let's underscore it's just early August, right? I think it's the 6th of August, the deadline
6th of August.
Deadline for submission. So you've
13 days.
Yeah.
13 days or 12 days from tomorrow.
We made a show last week which was 21 days to 1984,
Yeah.
right? Which I thought was quite a good title.
1984 is getting closer.
Yeah, it is. And the point there is that 1984 was very much about how information can be controlled and how governments control information, and therefore how people can be made to think particular things. And I think this is a very, very potent example here that we're talking now of that same thing, and not least because of this unequal relationship between information from governments are always to be allowed and everything else not. And it's also worth saying, Robbie, isn't it, that the way this is going to be executed is that the large social media platforms would ultimately be given the responsibility for weeding out and filtering anything that doesn't fit the new rules as effectively suggested that they would play out. So effectively, it makes the big social media companies the cops on this. And of course, what they will do is they will just go over the top and say, well, in that case, we can't have this, we can't have that, we can't this person, etc., etc. So it really does beg a huge question about the way that social media is going to work if this were to come through. So it's really important to express concerns, not least because, and I, for one, there's a lot of rubbish on social media, but you know, we're adults, we should be able to filter out the good and the bad, the right and the wrong. And I do believe that if you actually take away the story other than the one that the government wants to effectively propagate, what you've then got is totalitarianism.
Yep. Hey, and maybe you can't rule out that the timing of this, I mean, I know it's been in the works for a bit, but the social media companies did willingly engage in censorship in the last few years. And in fact, can I say, I mean, people noticed it in COVID. In terms of the subjects that I'm on about, the foreign policy debates where I'm actively debunking the lies that are fueling wars all over the world, the American social media platforms were always censoring that stuff. We've always been dealing with it. So what they did in COVID was not surprising to me at all. What we now have, though, is this interesting phenomenon where Elon Musk has bought Twitter, renamed it X. For what reason, I do not know. But anyway, not that I didn't join Twitter for the first half the decade because I wasn't impressed with the name to start with. So who cares if it's X? But now it's we're used to it being Twitter. And he released the Twitter files, and the Twitter files showed the extent of the collaboration between the social media platforms and the American security apparatus, and especially a partisan one. And it was only partisan. Let me make this point: the American national security apparatus is absolutely bipartisan. Absolutely bipartisan. The Republicans are not better than the Democrats. The Republicans are the scum of the earth who blew up a country, Iraq. Never forget that. But Donald Trump is not a normal Republican. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is not a normal Democrat. And you will see them look partisan when it comes to those sort of people, right? And so this was a specific kind of attack. And it looks partisan. It actually wasn't. People are seeing that the FBI for what it actually is. People like me saw the FBI for what it was for decades, but now all these conservative Americans are seeing it for what it is. And the Twitter files actually confirm that. And so is one of the impulses of this kind of law the fact that governments like Australia are realizing, well, hang on, we probably can't rely on social media platforms because there is a backlash and they want to have customers. We probably can't rely on them to do it voluntarily like they've done until now, especially in COVID. We're going to have to force it onto them. And yes, this is not the same kind of censorship law as, the Gestapo coming in and breaking down your printing press. You and I, Martin, will be able to have honest, frank discussions with each other over the phone, perhaps, until they find a way to censor that. But nevertheless, over the phone, in person, That's not covered by this law. But social media has become such an important alternative to the mainstream media. You can see why they want to crack down on it, right? There's numerous examples. In fact, I was talking to John Adams the last 24 hours about an example of mainstream media sitting on a story now. John will break it eventually. I won't spoil it, but we know mainstream media is sitting on a story now because that's how the system works. Editors are squashing a story that's a huge story, and that's how the system works. And if it was only mainstream media available to report what's going on, governments would be comfortable with that. They can just call up the editors and say, squash that story. Social media, they can't control, right? And social media, what we're doing now is the sort of thing they can't control. A lot of our success in the last 5 years in terms of getting up these inquiries, influencing the debate, has come because, well, I'll just share some of the stories, Martin, but a few years ago, you were very active with us in the Christine Holgate campaign, where we blew the whistle on what was happening there, right, and how the banks were behind, her ouster by Scott Morrison, and that got into an inquiry in the Senate, and the way we got that inquiry up was by getting people to hit the phones as usual, and you and I would do quick recordings of a show in the morning. And hear later that day that executives at Australia Post had been watching it, right, freaking out at what we were talking about. This was happening in real time. And the few thousand people who watched that show that morning, a bunch of them got off the show and hit the phone straight away and achieved the outcome that we wanted. We can do things in real time with social media that back in the day, the Citizens Party's been going for 35 years. In the early 2000s, we did print runs of our newspaper called The New Citizen. A whole bunch of those print runs was up to 1 million copies. We printed 1 million copies of our paper, distributed them all around Australia. We used to do this thing where we would letterbox Canberra. We would pay letterbox distributors to put one of our newspapers in every letterbox in Canberra, because our thinking was, most of those people work for the government, so we'll get the message through to them somehow. And that was a hugely expensive, time-consuming process, right? There was a big delay between the printed message and them reading it, but that's how we had to try and influence politics back then. And we still did plenty of successful things, including having a huge impact on the debate about the terrorism laws back in 2002. But social media has come along and allowed us to have that kind of influence in real time. No wonder the governments are freaking out about it and trying to shut it down, right? This is a real potential threat. And so for someone like me who has a gripe about the misinformation, and, we can all find misinformation on social media we don't like, it's just about us being adults and taking the good with the bad, but realizing that they're not shutting it down because of the bad, they want to shut it down because of the good.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to underscore again, a couple of weeks to get a submission in. If you feel strongly about this, get that submission in. But I think you should also set this in the context of a couple of other things, Robbie, as well. And that is, of course, that we've been battling with the branch closures, particularly in regional areas. And in fact, we've been using social media as part of that program, which has been quite successful. We've got quite a few submissions. And once again, what we're showing is that the power of social media can be harnessed to good and to highlight. And for example, I know that you've had a run with ANZ about something you said because something they said, right? And NAB, of course, had to admit that they weren't actually counting everything by way of transactions in the branch. And we've highlighted that.
I think ANZ is the princess bank. The story of the princess and the pea, Martin?
Yeah, I do.
The princess that was so sensitive that she could feel a pea under 13 mattresses or something.
Yeah.
So ANZ had a flip out at something said on a social media account that has 1,000 followers.
Yeah.
Such is the level of stress that they're going through at the moment because of our campaign to expose what they're doing with these branch closures, and they're all on edge. And we've got CBA to back down from its plans for at least the next 3 years. They've got a 3-year moratorium on branch closures. We've got Westpac to reverse 8 closures that they'd already announced. And they haven't announced any more. So, that was a direct impact so far. We've got NAB to have to admit at a hearing 2 weeks ago that they've been lying their head off, and there's certainly going to be consequences for that in the next hearing. In fact, I'm going to Canberra next week to have discussions with politicians to make sure they're clear on how deliberately deceptive NAB has been to they've shut down 30 branches across regional Australia this year. Martin, you just all right.
Sorry.
What do you mean the first time you heard me laugh? Now you've heard me laugh twice. Don't do that to me. I laugh a lot, just not when I'm talking about when I'm having to react to your trolling me.
Yeah.
Anyway, enough said. So NAB's had to back down. So NAB hasn't backed down yet, but NAB has been absolutely unmasked, and I'm going to make sure these politicians know that and get mad about it, because they've shut down 30 branches just in a regional Australia just this year, 30 branches in total defiance of this inquiry. And so we see that they're freaking out now. And then ANZ, of course, what they did was they took exception to this post on social media, and they called the person who posted it. And even though it's only got 1,000 followers, they demanded it be taken down. And the person has refused. But this was an act of intimidation by ANZ to try and intimidate this person. But in reality, it's ANZ who's feeling intimidated. That's the issue. They're feeling the glare of what we've put on them. And a lot of that is thanks to the power of this social medium to get us to mobilise people to get these inquiries up, keep the heat on, etc., and it's starting to work.
Yeah, I'll also make another point about social media. Of course, Jared Rennick is a very active social media politician, probably one of the most active in the country. But interestingly, of course, he didn't get pre-selected for his Queensland seat, and again, some of that could possibly be because there were people who weren't comfortable with some of the positions that he had through the social media. So it is a very interesting case study in how social media can actually play out.
Well, I think it's fascinating. The Liberal Party in Queensland that needs to hold on to that third Senate seat is more intent on having someone in there they can control on social media than having someone who can win that seat. Right? Jared made himself. I mean, Jared is a threat to the establishment on a lot of his positions, not least the fact that he's the guy who responded to our campaign on the banks, and the banks aren't like the banks on the campaign we've taken up against them. They are in retreat. Now, we're not winning, right? I won't go so far as to say that, but they're definitely in retreat. They're looking for ways to shore up their position, I'm sure, and they're going to play all kinds of tricks, etc. But they're in retreat, and we are on the march, right? And that's because of a process that Jared Rennick was prepared to lead. So the problem for Jared is he's a Liberal, and the Liberal Party was founded by the banks. It actually was in 1943. And in 1943, the banks founded the Institute of Public Affairs, and in 1944, the Institute of Public Affairs founded the Liberal Party. So, the attitude of true Liberals was expressed by John Howard in 2017 when the heat was really on for the Banking Royal Commission. What was John Howard's instinctive response from his core that expressed the whole history of the Liberal Party? That's rank socialism. Don't hold banks to account for anything. That's rank socialism, right? They've now got a guy in their ranks, speaking of rank, in their ranks, Jared Rennick, who is prepared to take these banks on because he sees through their crap, and he also sees the power of a public bank to take away their power. And he's a huge rep and a champion for the public bank. In fact, he was on ABC in Brisbane just a couple of weeks ago, use that interview and that platform to push the cause for a public bank. And that's going to be one of the outcomes of this inquiry. And he's happy to be in the Liberal Party. He would win them the seat, the third Senate seat, but the power brokers in Queensland have said, "Oh, no, we'd prefer someone we can control. Thank you very much, even if it costs us the seat." That's essentially what they're saying. So anyway, it's up to Jared what he does, after that. But this fight will go on, and all you got to do is look at the primary vote, Martin, of the major parties, right? And you see that they're on the descending. They're descending, and the non-major party vote is on the ascendancy. And then if you want to see something also extraordinary that just underscores the kind of times we're living in, and we've been living in them for a while, but these are times when the public is not rusted on anymore. Look at the latest opinion poll out of Perth, because the Western Australian Labor government, by right, should be in power for 20 years with the monster majority that Mark McGowan got at the last election. I mean, that's easy. They're 4-year fixed terms. They should have enjoyed 20 years. In the space of one opinion poll, they've lost 20 points because of their arrogance in response to this Aboriginal heritage thing over there. Probably the fact they've lost a margin with Mark McGowan is going as well, because he was quite popular. But nevertheless, the public is not as rusted on as used to be the defining feature of Australian politics, right? And that's where, if we can get people to think in non-partisan ways and think about solutions and policy outcomes, like we're doing with our campaigns on the banks, on reforming corruption in the financial system and the ASIC inquiry, etc., those sort of things, like we did with the cash ban. Even when we're not in Parliament, we can achieve outcomes in Parliament, right? That's the power of social media.
Yeah, absolutely. And, one of the things that I want to come back to, Robbie, is trajectory into the future, because, of course, there is a series of choices that people make as to the way society will be in the future, right? And there's a future definition of society where effectively thoughts are controlled, where effectively you're told what to think. You might link it into, central bank digital currency, removal of cash, so that effectively you can wrap it into a social score, and therefore you can be controlled through that mechanism. Now, that's a future that some are talking about as being a very real potential end game. And you can look to some places around the world where people are taking steps. I notice in the US, the discussion there about central bank digital currency is all about giving the Federal Reserve more levers to be able to impose monetary policy, right? So that's one future. But then there's also an opportunity to say, no, hang on a moment. There is a different route here we could take that would actually be into a different future, which is why I titled this show about society and where society might end up. Because if we're not careful, we sleepwalk into this rather dystopian future, in my view. But there is still an opportunity to steer it in a different direction and effectively say, no, hang on a moment. There's a better way.
Yeah, I mean, we take our inspiration from the past. This is why we're big champions of a public bank. Just invest in your economy, invest in your people, invest in the means of production, right? Invest in the things that increase your productivity. And you'll find that when people start to feel security in their employment, in their economic well-being, in their future, they'll be happier, right? But you can't cheat on that. You've actually got to, you've got to make sure that the tools of the financial system work for the people, and that's what we don't have. Now, can I say, I just to weigh into a debate that the CFMEU started today. So they've got this. I heard a little bit this National Press Club address. You might not have heard about it, Martin. So the secretary of the CFMEU today announced this. They've done this work, and they want Australia to have a super profits tax. an across-the-board super profits tax in order to build social housing, because we're going to need all this enormous expansion of social housing in Australia. And we do need social housing for sure. And so that's their idea. Let's have a super profits tax. Our party, I mean, I'm not necessarily opposed to super profits tax, especially for some of the super profits, but put that aside, there's plenty of taxation going on in the economy. I think we could probably do well to crack down on the people who should be paying their fair share who don't, right? And they're the ones who tend to use PwC, Ernst & Young, KPMG and Deloitte as their accountants. So they probably deserve better attention and tighten that sort of thing up. But in our view, we need to be thinking about the things that are going to make our economy actually grow, right? And when you make the economy grow through investment, not through taxation, through investment, that's when everyone can benefit. The biggest expansion of social housing in Australia per capita was in the decade after World War II. And the whole thing, we built 90,000 homes in a decade, all funded by the Commonwealth Bank. Ben Chifley set it up, and the Commonwealth Bank lent to the state housing commissions, and they built the homes. My grandmother lived in one almost her whole life until she'd moved into a nursing home right at the very end in Stawell in Western Victoria. I always remember going and visiting her, and she was in this housing commission home that she was a single mum. She'd raised my mum and her brothers and sisters in, and it was a great place. It had 4 bedrooms and, nice big yard. Me and my brothers and sisters played cricket in the backyard. This was a housing commission home in Stawell in Victoria that had been built post-war under this scheme. And these are all over the place. South Australia had an even, in some ways, a more impressive one because it was a state-based one just before the war that I think Sir Thomas Playford, if I'm right, was the Premier at the time. Anyway, there was this massive expansion of social that they did relative to their size back in those days. But this is the sort of things governments used to do. They didn't have to wring their hands over where we're going to get the money from. They just invested in it, right? They made it work and they invested in it. What we've got now is governments that are too timid to do that because they don't want to step on the toes of the private sector and the banks and take charge of these kind of things themselves through their own investment mechanisms, like a public bank like Chifley did. They're just not going to do that. And so they can't deliver for the true needs of the economy, so they don't, right? And we end up in this kind of inflationary hellhole in which we exist, where no problems, governments are talking about the problems all the time, but no one has any confidence that they'll be solved. So let's go back to the things that worked. We had our greatest public debt in 1948. It peaked at 140% of gross domestic product. 140%. It was enormous. Thing is, it was our war debt. Most of it is actually borrowed from the people of Australia. So when the government paid it back, it stayed in Australia. It wasn't borrowed from overseas, where most of our debt now, our government debt now, more than 50% of it, something like up to 3/4, is actually owed overseas. So that's a greater burden already. So, but we had a huge debt after World War II, and we embarked on the biggest and most expensive project in our history, the Snowy Mountains project, which at the time, like in today's dollars, would have been $300 billion. $300 billion. Imagine Albanese announcing a $300 billion project today and say, look, we're going to build a project that transforms Australia. No way in a million years. Well, not unless it's a war project, i.e. $368 billion for ridiculous nuclear submarines. But in terms of something that benefits Australia, they're not capable of doing it. Why not? So, our party, we've helped to promote ideas like Project Iron Boomerang across the top of the country. This could be a project that helps to, that's right, George. This could be the project that helps to reindustrialise the country. Water is a key factor in this country. So another one would be that we've been championing for a while is the Bradfield scheme. We need to be really thinking about the potential for high-speed rail. We shouldn't be, with high-speed rail, we could think of Sydney and Melbourne as larger cities, like the hubs of virtual cities, because you can build up the regional towns and connect them with high-speed rail to these big, there's one idea that if you take Melbourne, Geelong, Ballarat, Bendigo, and Traralgon over on the side, they could all be connected by high-speed rail that gets the people who live there to Melbourne within 20 minutes. And so they can effectively think of themselves as suburbs of Melbourne. And that makes it much more livable for the people who work in Melbourne. They can live out in those places with bigger houses, bigger yards for their kids, et cetera, rather than cram them into suburbs like that one that John Adams and I did a show on also in 2019, Donnybrook, where they're just crammed in. There's a big sheep paddock. In the middle of it, this sheep paddock is a suburb, right? Literally, it's surrounded by sheep paddock. And everyone is just crammed into this suburb, and all the houses, there's no gap between the houses. They're right beside each other. They've got a tiny strip of backyard, so no backyard to speak of. And this is the sort of norm for Australia now. And I remember just my reaction to that at the time, because I grew up in a very different Australia. But with infrastructure, we don't need to think in this kind of limited way, right? We could invest in the things that make all that sort of stuff possible. But that's thinking long term. That's thinking about what's good for the country, right? Rather than thinking about, how do we help our friends in the private sector maximize their profit in the here and now and stuff the future. Anyway, so that's the sort of there's just some of the things that our party thinks about, or what the future could look like if we took an approach where we took control of the financial system, cleaned up the corruption, and invested in it to make it happen.
Yeah, and there is a path. There's an alternative path there that clearly is quite different, and part of it would be a public bank that would actually invest in those things. It would actually spend the sort of money that we should be spending on in terms of the infrastructure, because around the world infrastructure is just decaying left, right and centre. Funnily enough, though, we seem to have enough money for very large defence budgets, and I have to say that I sometimes worry about the priorities, right? Because it seems to me that another 10 billion here or there for another defence project seems to just get nodded through, whereas the real issues that we need to actually face as a society, we just can't seem to find a way to do them. And housing is a great example. So somehow the priorities are not actually aligned to the interests of the people. And I find that very troubling, particularly in the current environment. And it doesn't seem to me that either side of politics, mainstream at least, have any interest in doing the right thing.
No, they don't. Now, but we're finding exceptions, and that's why I just think you can't take a cynical approach and just see every new piece of bad news as confirming your worldview that everything's screwed up and nothing can change. You got to keep working to change the system, and then you got to identify strategically the points that can be changed that can start the process, right? So our party has we've identified that for us, that in terms of the power, what the old Labor Party used to call the money power, the banks get to act like a dictatorship over the country and frankly over the world. The central bank, the central banks that are also the ones pushing the central bank digital currency approach, etc. They're allowing the private banks to go digital, blah blah blah. They're increasingly concentrating their power in the Bank for International Settlements, which was intended to be that power all along, right? So that's the money power, and it's got to be broken. And the only way to break it is to go back and see how that was done in the past, and that was done through public banks, because the money power want to have a private monopoly, because they know that with a private monopoly over banking, the banks will always do what they need to do to maximize their profits, because that will always come first. Their relationship with their shareholders justifies them maximizing their profits. You could argue that back in the day, there was at least a different culture among banks where they had an eye, they weren't entirely short-term in their thinking, because society wasn't entirely short-term in their thinking. So that made them marginally better than they are now, whereas the banks now are just short-term in their thinking, right? But the fight in days of yore was people realised, no, to break that power, you've got to make them compete with the public bank, because if governments have their own banks, yeah, they could use it for bad, but they can also use it for good. And when they show that banking can be used for good, if you don't use banking to maximise profit, but to use the power of investment to transform the economy, and people see that, they'll want to keep it. And we have that in Australia with the nostalgia, and it's a justified nostalgia when people remember. You told people about the Commonwealth Bank and what it used to be, they remember, yeah, that was the People's Bank, right? It was always called the People's Bank, and it was never perfect, but the system then was better than this current system we've got now. And what we've got now is a system where the banks get to rig the show, right? So we had this event last year in November in the Parliament, where the Greens thought they had a deal with Labor to bring in civil penalties for bankers. The bankers that were actually responsible for some of these big stuff ups, they should at least be fined. Even if they're not going to go to jail, at least be personally fined. So the bank's not just not the bank fined, which is paid by the shareholders, but the bankers themselves, the individual executives, get fined. And they had this deal. Labor agreed to it. The next day, Labor backflipped because the banks called up and said, no way, no how, and they showed they're the true power. And another example of the banks flexing their power was in 2019, after the Banking Royal Commission, because the Royal Commission showed they're all a pack of crooks. And one of the issues was irresponsible lending. And so there was an attention on this, and the head of ASIC at the time, James Shipton, said, we are going to follow the directive of the Royal Commission and say, why not litigate? We, instead of just slap the banks over the wrist, take them to court. At James Shipton's head of enforcement, Daniel Crennan, said at an AFR function, he said the banks should fear us. And what did the banks do in response? They stopped lending. They actually stopped. They went on a credit strike. And there's John Adams shared with me, he found this interview from 2019 where Tikki Fullerton is interviewing James Shipton, and she's attacking him because as if it's his fault that the banks have gone on a credit strike to starve the government into submission on this question of cracking down on their lending standards. But it worked. And somehow she blamed James Shipton. And James Shipton, he was the only head of ASIC that the banks ever complained about. They've never complained about any of these other heads of ASIC that have been totally useless or worse, because they love those guys at ASIC. One guy finally tried to clean them up, and that's the banks flex their muscle that way. Back in 2016, the government of South Australia tried to introduce a tax on banks. The banks went on a credit strike in South Australia and starved South Australia into submission. Because they have a monopoly, they have the power. The only way you'll break that power is with a public bank, right? But that will break the power. And then you can use, once you've got that kind of competition with a public bank, you can use it for good. And here's what will happen: the things that the government does, the things that the government invests in to open up the economy, will create opportunities for the private sector. The private banks will come in behind that and make a lot of money lending into those opportunities that in a million years they would never have pioneered to open up. Never. But a government can do it, and then they will get opportunities that way. And 200 years ago, Alexander Hamilton wrote this in a report to George Washington when he was the first Secretary of the Treasury of the United States. He talked about this phenomenon. He said the banks hate the idea of a national bank because they want 100% control. They prefer 100% control over a smaller economy than 70 or 60% of a much larger economy where their share is much larger than the 100% of the smaller one, because what they want is total control. That was his point. Whereas if the banks, if the government is allowed to do what it can do with the bank, everyone can benefit, but the banks won't have total control, and they don't like that. So they're pushing it. So that's what we're fighting them at that level, and we have to identify the things they're doing to increase their control. Central bank digital currencies is one, or at least one aspect of it. Not to get into too technical detail, there's one aspect of central bank digital currencies, which is what governments around the world who are not in line with the Americans and British are trying to do to get around the dominance of the US dollar. And you need the technology of digital currency to do that. So that part is not part of some kind of global plot. But the kinds of central banks' digital currencies that you hear the Bank for International Settlement talking about, this is about control. Getting rid of cash is about control. So we're all locked into the banking system. We're then exposed to bail-ins, what they do with interest rates, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. All that is about increasing their control. Now we've got the RBA review, which is, has recommended that it has no accountability to the Australian government whatsoever. Again, increasing their global BIS-centred control over the central banks, and through them allow the private banks to absolutely run riot. We've witnessed, sorry to go on a bit here, but just I'll finish with this one point, Martin. We've witnessed in this last period of turmoil in the United States financial system around these banking crashes there, in front of our eyes, what looks like a rescue attempt by the Federal Reserve for the banks has actually been a naked power grab by JP Morgan to get more and more and more control of the US banking system under bring more of the US banking system under its control, right? And that's been cast as if it's some kind of a rescue attempt to save people's deposits in the American banking system. No, that's just another example of the way this system works on autopilot almost, to just constantly get more and more control into the hands of this private banking oligarchy. We have to break that. The people have to break that. And that's why our campaign focuses on things like we do.
Yeah, and just to bring that into context, if you look at the relative income from a tax perspective that Australia gets, and you look at how much is actually sucked out of corporations relative to that sucked out from individuals and small businesses, well, the mix has gone dramatically up from ordinary tax that we pay because they've left the various bands unmoved by inflation.
Yep.
And in fact, corporations are paying less and less because they've got more and more ability to be able to mess with their balance sheets and get advice from the big four or the big five, and wonderful tax saving strategies. Plus, of course, the government hands out massive amounts of tax to big corporations. Look at the gas industry, look at the oil industry, look at the resources sector, and others too. So a lot of the money in the system gets pointed in the wrong direction. It comes right back to what we were saying. How do we actually build a society that's funded appropriately to invest in the things that need to be invested in? And at the moment, it's all set up wrong. So effectively, the millions, the people who have to pay their taxes, are getting squeezed left, right, and centre, particularly with higher interest rates. And yet the amount of money that's available to do the things we need to have done is getting less and less, although we can afford to buy a lot of defence stuff and other things and continue to support the big end of town.
Defence stuff, it's a bloody bonanza if you're in the defence industry. If you're a weapons maker in the world right now, my God, you're in the money. You're laughing all the way. You're right there with the banks running the show. They're just taking the piss out of the public. I mean, absolutely are. And then they sell it to us, as we're fighting to defend, democracy from these threats of these, autocrats, et cetera, et cetera. But as we've just been discussing here, our countries are turning into the autocrats. Our countries are turning into the totalitarian countries, because actually they're not trying to protect us from that. They are the totalitarians because they're trying to protect a system that isn't working for us. And they know that at a certain point, just as when communism, it got to that breaking point in the communist bloc, where the economy wasn't working, and it was, there was no denial of that fact. It led to these uprisings and revolutions that ended communism in the 80s. What do we think we've got? You can pretend our system is ordained by God, but it's not. Whatever this system is, it is not working for the people, and you're going to get increasing public strife out of that. And so they're going to try and the public need to focus on their responsibility in this, right? So the reason we call ourselves the Citizens Party is because we have the view that the citizens must take responsibility for the system. Even if you had a perfect government, it would only work if the citizens take responsibility for that. This what's the saying? The price of liberty is eternal vigilance, or whatever. Right? In other words, there's a great example of when the Americans won their revolution. Thomas Jefferson wrote the first Constitution. It was called the Articles of Confederation. And it was just too weak. It was an unworkable government. The central government was completely weak. It wasn't workable. So Ben Franklin led this discussion in Philadelphia, and they wrote what is now the current American Constitution. But technically what they were doing was treason, because they'd already agreed to this rather weak form of a constitution. Anyway, the rest is history. And there's if you go, I've been to Philadelphia, and you can go to see this Independence Hall, and they have a chair there with a rising sun, a picture of a rising sun on it, not a Japanese rising sun, but anyway, that there was a question, is the sun rising or setting on the American Republic? That was one of the questions asked at the time, because they're always thinking about this stuff. And as he left the hall at the end of this whole procedure, a woman passing by said, "Oh, what have we got, Dr. Franklin?" And he said, "A republic, madam, if we can keep it." And what that last line refers to is the fact that the system of government you have is a reflection of the fitness of the population, which has consented to be governed in that way. And so there's one of the things we've tried to do in the last few years is break this mentality that people have that the government's screwed up and there's nothing I can do about it, so I'm not even going to pay attention. Break that mentality and actually then get them to think, well, and stop thinking the self-fulfilling prophecy, there's nothing I can do, right? And actually start to try and do something, engage in the process. And at times I've feared, Martin, that the danger we have is that this may start to feel to people to be sort of routine and almost humdrum, because we say something really dramatic on this show, breaking news, this is happening, and then what do we say they should do? Sit down and write a submission to an inquiry. But that's how but that is the avenue by which the public gets to engage in the system. It's there. There is an avenue for public engagement. And the more the public does it, the bigger the impact that it actually has. Right? Yeah, it's not as sexy as Guy Fawkes blowing up the English Parliament, but that didn't work. They only celebrate Guy Fawkes Night, or what's the date of that? November 5th.
November the 5th.
They only celebrate that because it didn't work,
yeah.
not because it did, right? You can take that approach. That seems sexy. The real sexy approach, though, is in putting yourself as part of the process. Don't feel divorced from the process. Be part of the process. And the more that happens, the more you're influencing the machinery of government, and that's how the people can start taking government back. In the 40s and 50s, these two major parties in Australia had about 400,000 members each. In other words, and that was when we had 10 million Australians or whatever. Both parties were deeply entwined with the grassroots of the public. That's not the case anymore, right? It's one of the reasons that they're so divorced from reality often, right? They're part of a technocratic class, and you can see the disasters that come from that. Well, okay, don't just complain about it. Let's get in there and make a change. Let's get in there and participate in the process, because the politicians are better for it when they come up against us. And if you see the things that we've been able to get Parliament to focus on and begin debates on, and even if we haven't resolved those debates, we've got them in motion and they keep coming up, right? Then you realise, well, okay, we can actually, at least have a say here, and then you don't know all the ways you can influence the outcome. I mean, right now, ASIC is under intense scrutiny, simply because, John Adams did what he did, wrote a report. We got behind his report and the push for an inquiry. It actually influenced senators to say, yeah, we're going to take it up. The longer this inquiry has gone on, and the more tense it's getting now, because the ASIC's defying the inquiry, and Senator Bragg, the chairman, is accusing ASIC of contempt, etc. Bragg's actually got tougher from this process. He's doing and saying tougher things now than he was back in November last year, right? And it's all out of this. We are part of the process that helped to make all that happen. And there's only there's a relative few thousand of us, really. Think about the best numbers you get. I mean, I think, sometimes you get 50,000 views on some of those shows, but not all 50,000 of those people activate and do stuff. It's a relative small handful of Australians, a minority of Australians, who are making this happen.
Absolutely. But it just comes back to, there is a process, there is democracy, we have opportunities to make a say, particularly on this particular bill now, so over the next couple of weeks, but more broadly to engage with the political process. And so step one is to raise people's awareness of what's going on, so that people just don't say, oh, it's too complicated, or we'll leave it to somebody else, right? So get engaged. But then step two is to actually make a fuss and, use the processes that are there to be able to actually make sure that politicians understand what you think is right and what you think is wrong. And it's interesting to me, Robbie, having done this for a few years now, how politicians actually are quite malleable once they understand where people really are, and they actually think, well, hang on a moment, there's an issue here. I mean, we take Gerard Rennick and the branch thing. Well, one of the reasons why Gerard did what he did was because I had him on my show and we discussed it, right? And that was early on in the process, right? And he said, so it was like, a little light bulb. Oh, this is a really big issue, right? So it's actually amazing how from small conversations and small points of intervention, things can actually, snowball and cascade. But you have to start that journey. And I guess one of the things we try and do on our channel, and you do as well, is to raise awareness of these issues, so that effectively people realise that, one, there's things we can do, and two, it's really, really important to grasp the nettle and make a fuss and make those submissions and keep pushing, rather than just saying it's all too hard. We'll never win. Well, we know we can actually make a difference. Look at the the cash ban. Look at some of the other stuff that we've done. And so this is an opportunity for people to make a stand on the current draft bill that's there, relating specifically to media censorship, but more broadly engage around the future of society, because ultimately we get the society we deserve because we get the society that we actually vote for.
And even the mainstream media can be influenced in a positive way, Martin. I mean, we're amazed with this bank branch closures campaign because the media can't cover it enough. I've never seen so much coverage in my life. Remember, I'm talking to you, because you were there with us. So for the viewers' benefit, in November and December last year, Martin and I and the independent journalist Dale Webster, who's done all this work on the bank branches, we were constantly engaging with each other and talking to each other and discussing, what can we do? There was a number of towns we were working with. How do we save those towns? What can we do, etc. And we're constantly having back and forth on this. And we had this breakthrough. The 19th of December last year, we got a breakthrough because the 7:30 report covered the story. It's like, oh, great, I've got some media coverage. I mean, it is now almost routine to get significant media coverage of this story now. It is everywhere. The Daily Mail last week ran like a 4-part series on bank branch closures, including covering some really important detail on things like the fact that if a bank is cashless, it is not a branch. And the tabloid Daily Mail covered that in a way the mainstream media actually hasn't until now. It's a technical point, but it's actually quite an important point. Dale Webster's been jumping up and down about the fact that media haven't covered it. Well, the tabloid Daily Mail did last week. I've never been on talkback radio more in my life. I've been on talkback radio all across the country, all the main talkback shows in the main capital cities. In fact, 6PR in Perth have me on speed dial, I think, because every time there's a breakthrough in the campaign, they call me up to say, congratulations, come on our show, let's talk about it. And that's the biggest commercial radio station in Perth. 5AA as well in Adelaide, 2GB in Sydney, 3AW here in Melbourne. They want to cover this thing because what they know is that we've touched on a really raw point in the, a sore point in the population, right? People are actually really sick of the disruption that happens from these branch closures. And wait till they hear that, NAB was lying, because NAB's been on this branch closure spree claiming that, visitation, they're only closing branches because visitations have dropped off. But as you showed on your video, 2 weeks ago in a hearing, the NAB executive had to admit that they don't count the visits to branches that don't involve deposits or withdrawals. And there's a lot of reasons to go to a branch to visit a branch that don't involve deposits or withdrawals, especially to help solve the problems that come from online banking. You have to go to the branch to sort them out. So there's a lot more visits to branch than they're counting and they're admitting to, right? And they just admitted they don't measure that. I mean, people from one end of the country to the other who've lost a NAB branch recently should be absolutely furious about this. So that's going to become a theme, I predict. Pay attention to this issue. But they wanted to cover that. The ASIC thing has become an absolute drama in its own right. And so you've got, the Australian and especially the Australian Financial Review. There you go. And John Adams has asked the question, will Senator Bray get 39 votes next week to target ASIC Chair Joe Longo? So John's demanding that Longo be referred to the Privileges Committee. John Adams wants to bring back jailing people who mislead Parliament, and I agree with him. We should bring back that. It's happened before. The power of the Privileges Committee, it has that at its disposal to do that, and maybe we need to do that to get these people that are trying to obstruct the people to take the process more seriously. So anyway, that's going to be an interesting discussion. But yeah, there's been quite a bit of reporting of the drama here unfolding between Bragg and Longo. And every now and then quite often actually, John gets a mention for the fact that he instigated this in the media, and it's driving ASIC nuts every time John Adams gets a mention. Though we know that from the Freedom of Information request. If you haven't seen it, go and look at on our channel, the Citizens Report channel on YouTube, to the discussion John and I had on this last week, because he was in Melbourne, so I got to interview him on our show, and you can see some of the thinking behind what John's been doing. But the media can't help but report it, right? And that's a significant thing to note, because the media otherwise can be very, very, very frustrating. People know that a big part of the problem with how broken our system is the media control in Australia. But what I'm saying is, you can also, I'm not saying that you can overcome that completely, but you can have more success than you realise if you take up issues that with a great deal of rigour. You have your evidence lined up, you've got a lot of thinking behind it, you build the public support, and you make it irresistible for the media to follow. So don't just go waving around any old conspiracy theory you pick up and say, why isn't the media reporting on this? You got to do the work. You got to provide the evidence. You got to line up the facts. You got to build the public support. Then, some of the things that you're talking about, they'll have to cover in one way or another. And that's, so that's also something that can be achieved with this kind of approach.
Absolutely, Robbie. Well, we've run out of time, but thank you very much indeed for sharing your thoughts this evening. And if people want to find out more, where do they go?
Citizensparty.org.au or the Citizens Report on YouTube, the Citizens Party's channel. That's where you'll see us most regularly, making full use of social media. Or you can follow me on Twitter at Robbie Barwick, or the Citizens Party at Citizens Party AU. What's this space? You'll see me tweeting a lot on banks, on stopping war with China, and right now on things like Julian Assange. I'm wearing my Assange t-shirt tonight in honour of the subject again. Julian Assange, David McBride, and this poor Dan Duggan, who's stuck in solitary confinement, an absolutely an American hero, an Australian citizen, a father of 6, and an absolutely innocent guy who, because utter scum, chicken hawks who ran from war when it was their turn to serve in Vietnam, etc., like John Bolton, who decided that they'd get off in the Trump administration on starting a war with China. They're victimising this guy, destroying him and his family, just to hold him up as the equivalent of a head on a pike for their propaganda war. So I'm big on that right now. You'll see that subject being covered extensively. They've got a lot of press today because of the court case that was in Sydney. But that's another example of a case that we take up, and the people involved in the case called me tonight to thank me and said we're the only organisation that's been game to do it, because everyone is cowed already. Everybody is cowed into submission to this Anglo-American foreign policy agenda, which is driving a lot of this stuff that we've been talking about tonight, including the kind of censorship. We're the only ones that have been prepared to take it on. So anyway, you'll see me tweeting on that a lot at the moment.
Well, Robbie, I say thank you very much. Really appreciate your time tonight. And
Thanks,
we will, I'm sure, be having more chats over the next next few weeks and months on these very, very important issues. And just to say, I'm going to take you offline now, Robbie. So thanks. Cheers. And yeah, you can go look at the comments. And just to say that next week, Damien Klassen will be on, and we're going to be talking about the markets and what's going on. Very significant, of course, this week with the decision in the US, decision in Japan and a few other places too. Next week, the Bank of England and, of course, the RBA. So some very important conversations to be had then. And just before I go, I will just show you once again the dogs. Well, one dog, Meteor's just slipped around the corner, but Luna is still there, and I think wants to go for a walk. She came and gave me a nudge a little while ago. So anyway, thank you very much indeed for spending some time with us this evening. We'll look forward to seeing you next week, and check out the other shows during the week. I'm going to end the show now, and have a good evening. This is Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics, signing off. Cheerio.